I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 19 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John epidemic, which is available now on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. The series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. This has opened the door in baseball for independent pitching labs to provide the biomechanical science and analysis that is often lacking. One of the first independent pitching coaches and most influential voices was the aforementioned Tom House. In addition to working with ASMI, he wrote books and provided training services to aspiring pitchers and was most active from 1990 to 2010. Although his conclusions on the process of pitching have changed considerably over his career, his 2009 work, Arm Action, Arm Path, and the Perfect Pitch would be a good representation of his contemporary teachings. House's fundamental approach to pitching mechanics was that each pitcher has their own unique signature, defined primarily by their genetics. This informing how they pitch, including their arm slot, or the angle of the arm in relation to the body at ball release. This signature was not to be changed so long as any component of it did not violate House's pitching checkpoints for safety and efficiency. Of greatest importance to House on these checkpoints was the concept of balance throughout the motion. If the body were in balance and not pulling off to one side or the other, the motion would be correct. He used images of some of the most successful pitchers of the early 2000s as his proof that they were doing what he was describing. His focus on balance carried through to each component of the pitching motion, with a key focus for him being the pitcher maintaining equal and opposite arms going into the front foot strike. His philosophy was that if the arms were equal and opposite, the torso would be balanced, allowing for free rotation from the legs, through the hips, and finally the arms. He is a believer in the kinematic chain and proposes that the primary development of force in the pitching motion comes from the separation of the hips and shoulder at landing, delaying shoulder rotation until the force from the legs can be transmitted up the body. The amount of separation he indicates as ideal is 60 degrees for elite velocity. To prove his hypothesis, he uses two proofs. The first being that a pitcher can throw approximately 80% of their maximum velocity from their knees without any forward momentum, by twisting the body. The second is that he found a strong correlation in his own research between maximum broad jump distance and throwing velocity. In his estimation, proving velocity in the pitching motion is produced in the legs and hips significantly as well. House was a proponent of an ideal motion, but as his approach matured, he expanded from using just Nolan Ryan as his ideal, and instead looked at stages in the pitching motion that elite pitchers achieve. This led to his conclusions about what elite pitchers do to create velocity and maintain their health. His approach is based on forms and postures the pitcher's body achieves rather than being informed by what the body is doing at a muscular level. For example, there is no discussion of the muscles required to develop velocity or in what proportion. It appears if you can achieve the various steps of the biomechanical chain, including the separation of hips and shoulders, velocity will result from that process, without any explanation of how to control the body to achieve those positions or cue the body to throw the baseball. A good example of this is his discussions and debates with other pitching coaches of the day regarding pushing off the rubber. There are two camps to the debate. If pitchers should reach a balance point that they could hold at the top of the motion before falling down the mound, or if they should drop their weight into their back leg to drive off the rubber. One approach uses primarily the momentum of the fall to load the hips, whereas the other is an active load into the back leg to drive the hips forward. The entire discussion was broached on the form of the motion rather than the fact that the hips both reach the same point at foot strike, or what muscles were being utilized in each variation. Tom House's observations regarding balance, delayed shoulder rotation, and equal and opposite arms may be correct, but it is unclear whether those are symptoms of a strong kinetic chain rather than the forces that create it. Due to the popularity of House's work, a small industry of books and programs for pitching instruction were created. The vast majority were written by former or current pitchers to add their voices to the conversation and sell licensed books with other authors. Books were written by Cy Young winners such as Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver with co-authors, but added little but anecdotal information useful for those studying the unique programs of a specific professional pitcher. Following the pioneering role of House in the field of pitching mechanics, a variety of other independent coaches started practicing and writing about their own, often unique, approaches. In the 2000s, a strong voice in the independent pitching community was that of Ron Wolforth, who who would open the Texas Baseball Ranch. What separated Wohlforth from the pack was his belief that velocity could be developed through training, selling the dream that those with weaker arms could train them to reach the pros. His purpose was to coach pitching from the perspective of mechanical efficiencies and athleticism first, utilizing a variety of resistance training activities including weights, resistance tubes, and later weighted baseballs, in conjunction with specialized drills to increase the velocity of his students. Many of these techniques came from another coach named Paul Nyman. It is important to understand how revolutionary this point of view was at a time when virtually every other pitching coach across the industry shared the consensus that pitching velocity and arm slot were an inherent genetic trait that could not be coached or trained. His students trained their athleticism and their sequencing by focusing on their balance, including the use of unstable surface training, such as trampolines and Bosu balls. The approach showed a great deal of success, with many students seeing velocity increases through his program and resulting as of the end of 2018 in 78 draftees that had attended his programs. Of key importance was the addition of weightlifting concepts, such as the joint-by-joint approach created by Michael Boyle and Gray Cook for evaluating the needs of the athlete. It assessed whether stability or mobility is required on each joint that performs a motion. This added much-needed expertise from the kinesiology and sport performance fields to the pitching conversation. Wohlforth would later work with Alan Yeager, a former baseball player and personal trainer, to implement these approaches further, particularly with the incorporation of surgical tubing resistance routines for the health and muscular development of the rotator cuff in a safe manner, a product that would later be termed Yeager bands. Bands of this style are now used in one form or another by almost every pitcher all the way to the professional level, particularly for warm-up in the bullpens of the smaller muscles of the rotator cuff. A further inclusion was stressing extreme long toss routines or throwing the ball a maximum distance to build arm strength. Both changed the focus from the form of the pitching motion to the result, throwing the baseball with velocity. This approach was not particularly analysis-based and more the transfer of the cross-training approaches that since 2000 have become prevalent across sports into the pitching realm. These approaches were quite successful in proving the usefulness of resistance training in developing velocity. Join me for episode 20 next week. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, if you want to jump ahead, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. See you next week.